This blind girl has an alcoholic and extremely violent father. In a tense moment, he does something terrible to her in the middle of the street, but a millionaire witnesses the scene and takes drastic action. Comment what you think will happen and subscribe to my channel to support my work. Little Ayla sat on the rough sidewalk as she did every afternoon. Her thin fingers gripped a worn red cane, a silent companion that guided her through the world of darkness she had known since birth. The sunglasses with the cracked lens barely managed to hide the recent bruise below her right eye, a purple mark that blended with older ones, forming a map of pain on her childish face. The late afternoon sun in Oakhaven beat down on the few pedestrians who hurried past, avoiding looking at the 6-year-old girl. Everyone there knew her story, or at least the part they could piece together from the screams that echoed every night from house number 12. Hank, her father, was a constant presence at the corner dive bar where he drowned his sorrows in bottles of cheap whiskey ever since he lost his wife in a household accident. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery mingled with the aroma of wet earth. It had rained earlier. Ayla inhaled deeply, her other senses always alert, compensating for the lack of sight. She could distinguish the footsteps of the neighbors, the distant barking of dogs, the sound of the TV on in the house next door. More importantly, she knew exactly how long it would be before her father returned from the bar. Mrs. Higgins, the lady who lived 2 houses down, passed by her carrying her grocery bags. As always, she slowed down, hesitated for a moment, but kept going. It was like that with everyone in Oakhaven. Compassion fought against the fear of getting involved, and fear always won. "Hey, kid!" A hoarse and familiar voice cut through her thoughts. It was Mr. Johnson, the owner of the convenience store. "It's almost time for your dad to come home. You better get inside." Ayla nodded slightly, her movements as contained as her voice. She stood up with the practice of someone who knew every crack in that sidewalk, every unevenness of the path. She walked daily. Her steps were small but sure, the cane gliding smoothly ahead of her. The sound of a car approaching caught her attention. It was different from the vehicles that usually passed by there. Smoother, quieter. The vehicle stopped near her, and Ayla could hear the sound of the door opening and closing, followed by firm footsteps on the sidewalk. "Good afternoon, little one." The voice was deep but gentle, unlike any other she knew in Oakhaven. It belonged to a man she could not see, but whose steps indicated that he was approaching cautiously. Before she could answer, another familiar sound made her entire body stiffen. Staggering footsteps and the unmistakable clinking of a glass bottle hitting against a leg. Her father was coming back from the bar earlier than usual. "What are you still doing here, girl?" Hank's drunken voice thundered down the street. "Didn't I tell you to stay inside?" Ayla tried to get up quickly, but in her haste her cane slipped, causing her to momentarily lose her balance. The sound of the bottle hitting the ground hard made several neighbors close their windows. "No!" The stranger's deep voice sounded closer and firmer. "If you lay a finger on her..." The silence that followed was as thick as a storm about to break. Ayla could feel the tension in the air, the strong smell of alcohol coming from her father, the heavy breathing of both men. "And who are you to meddle in my life?" Hank spat out the words. "This here is my daughter. I'll do what I want." "My name is Barrett," replied the stranger, his voice controlled but charged with an authority that made even Hank hesitate. "And from now on, I'm going to keep an eye on what happens on this street." Ayla felt a gentle hand on her shoulder, not the calloused hands of her father, but different hands, which helped her to get up carefully. The touch was firm but delicate, as if it understood her fragility without judging her for it. "Let's go home, Ayla." Hank's voice sounded lower now, almost a growl. "Tonight we'll talk properly about obeying your father." While she was practically dragged down the street, Ayla could still feel the presence of that stranger, Barrett, standing on the sidewalk. There was something different about him, something that made her heart beat faster, not out of fear, but out of an emotion she couldn't name. Maybe it was hope. What she could not see was the expression on Barrett's face as he watched father and daughter walk away. His dark eyes were fixed on the small figure that disappeared into the shadows of house number 12, and his right hand unconsciously squeezed a small scar below his left eye, a mark of a past that now seemed to echo in the present. On the horizon, dark clouds were beginning to form, foreshadowing a storm. But for Ayla, something had changed that afternoon. For the first time in her short life, someone had stood between her and her father. Someone had said no. The sound of the front door closing echoed down the silent street. The neighbors, one by one, went back to opening their windows, pretending that nothing had happened. But something had happened, and nothing would be the same in Oakhaven. That night, the screams from house number 12 were louder than usual. The neighbors went in early, closing doors and windows, turning up the volume on the televisions to muffle the sounds coming from the street. Inside the tiny room that was her refuge, Ayla huddled in a corner, clutching the red cane against her chest as if it were a protective amulet. The smell of alcohol permeated the air, mixed with the musty odor of the peeling walls. Hank staggered through the house, knocking over objects, cursing, his slurred voice alternating between anger and a contained cry that only appeared on the worst nights. "Your mother wouldn't want a daughter like this," he murmured between sobs. "You're just like her, just like her. Why didn't you die in her place?" Ayla had already memorized every word of this speech, every variation of this litany that was repeated almost every night. But today, there was something different in the air. The interference of that stranger, Barrett, had awakened a new fury in her father, as if someone had poked a long-forgotten wound. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Ayla heard the first movements in the house. Her father, still staggering from the previous night's drinking, dragged his feet through the kitchen. The smell of strong coffee invaded the room. It was one of the few things he still did regularly, a habit from the days when he worked as a bricklayer. "You're not leaving the house today," he grunted as he passed the bedroom door. "And if that pretty boy shows up here again..." The sentence hung in the air, loaded with unspoken threats. The hours dragged on like days. Ayla remained sitting on her bed, her ears attentive to every movement on the street. She could distinguish the sound of children going to school, the conversations of the neighbors, the calls of the street vendor selling corn cakes. Sounds that were once part of her daily routine now seemed to come from another world. Around noon, a different buzz caught her attention. Whispered voices, hesitant footsteps on the sidewalk in front of the house. Among them, she recognized the voice of Mrs. Higgins. "Mister, you better not get involved. People have tried to help before." "And what happened to those people?" Barrett's deep voice sounded clear, even in a low tone. "They left. Everyone ends up leaving Oakhaven. Only those who have nowhere else to go stay." Ayla approached the window, her fingers lightly brushing the rusty bars. She could feel the afternoon sun warming her face through the cracks in the torn curtain. Suddenly, a familiar sound made her heart race, the smooth engine of that different car. "Take this." Barrett's voice was closer now, probably talking to Mrs. Higgins. "If you hear anything, call me at this number, day or night." A rustle of paper, footsteps moving away, the sound of the car leaving. Ayla stood there motionless, trying to process what she had heard. Was someone really caring? It was hard to believe after so long. In the afternoon, a surprise, soft knocks on the back window. "Psst, girl," it was Mrs. Higgins' voice. "I brought you some soup. And there's a man asking about you. He left this here." Through the bars, Mrs. Higgins passed not only a plate of still warm soup, but also something that made Ayla hold her breath. A new pair of sunglasses. Her fingers ran over the smooth temples, so different from her broken glasses. "He said he'll be back tomorrow," Mrs. Higgins whispered. "Said he knows people who can help." At that moment, a noise in front of the house made both of them jump. Hank had come home earlier from the bar, and he wasn't alone. Male voices, unknown and hostile, filled the street. "That pretty boy's sticking his nose where it doesn't belong," a raspy voice commented. "We'll take care of him, Hank. Just say when." Ayla's heart froze. Her father was gathering the bar buddies, men as lost as he was, but much more dangerous. The fear she felt wasn't for herself. She was used to fear. It was for Barrett, the stranger who had dared to care. Mrs. Higgins quickly walked away, her footsteps almost inaudible on the packed dirt of the yard. Ayla returned to her corner, hiding the new glasses under the thin mattress. The soup, still warm, was the first decent meal she had had in days. On the street, the voices continued, planning, threatening, but something had changed inside Ayla. For the first time, she felt that she was not completely alone. Someone had noticed her existence, had cared enough to bring a gift, to leave a phone number, to promise to return. What she didn't know, as she savored each spoonful of soup, was that other people were also watching house number 12. Across the street, partially hidden behind a tree, a blonde woman with a backpack watched everything with an expression of deep anguish. Her eyes, red from crying so much, did not leave the window where Ayla was. Night fell on Oakhaven like a heavy blanket. The whispered plans on the street gradually gave way to the neighborhood's usual silence. But it was a different silence, now charged with promises and threats, with hope and fear. In the darkness of her room, Ayla clutched the new glasses against her chest, feeling for the first time in years that maybe, just maybe, her story didn't have to end as it had begun. The dawn brought with it a fine and persistent rain, the kind that seems to last an eternity. The roof of house number 12 was leaking in several places, creating small puddles on the concrete floor. Ayla had been awake for hours, attentive to every sound in the house. Her father had spent the whole night out, something that hadn't happened in a long time. Carefully, her fingers traced her face, mapping the most recent bruises. The newest one, just below her right eye, still throbbed to the touch. Sitting on her bed, she could hear the hum of Oakhaven awakening. The sound of the rain partially muffled the voices, but she could still distinguish fragments of conversations through the window. "They said he's important, got money." It was the voice of Mrs. Miller from the bakery. "And what would a man like that want with people like us?" replied someone Ayla didn't recognize. "Don't you know his story? I heard that." The voices were interrupted by the sound of a car approaching. Not Barrett's quiet car, but an old pickup truck that Ayla recognized by the noisy engine. It was Joe from the bar, bringing her father back. The heavy footsteps on the entrance stairs made her heart race. But there was something different today. Her father wasn't staggering as usual. His voice, when he spoke to Joe from the bar, was clear and firm. "Everything's settled then," said Hank. "When he shows up today, we'll show him that this isn't a place for uppity people." "Leave it to me," replied Joe. "The boys are already warned. No one will interfere in your life again, Hank." Ayla felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that, and tone in her father's voice well. It was the same one he used before the worst moments, when anger turned into something more calculated, more dangerous. The morning dragged on with torturous slowness. Hank remained in the living room, a rare thing, and received constant visits, male voices that came and went, conversations in low tones, occasional laughter that made Ayla cower in her corner. Around noon, a different movement caught her attention. Light footsteps in the backyard, followed by soft knocks on her bedroom window. "Ayla?" It was Mrs. Higgins' voice, even lower than usual. "I brought you a note. The man left it with me earlier before going to take care of some things. Said he'll be back in the late afternoon." Carefully, so as not to make any noise, Ayla approached the window. Mrs. Higgins slid a piece of paper through the bars, along with a bag that smelled of sweet bread. "I can't read," whispered Ayla, holding the paper without knowing what to do with it. "I'll read it to you," replied Mrs. Higgins, her voice trembling slightly. "It says, 'Little Ayla, don't be afraid, things will change today. I brought people who can help you and your father. He also needs help, even if he doesn't know it. Trust me, Barrett.'" Ayla clutched the paper against her chest, feeling the tears running down behind the new glasses she had put on that morning. They were different tears, not of fear or pain, but of an emotion she barely recognized. It was at that moment that she noticed something strange. A familiar smell, jasmine perfume, coming from somewhere nearby. It was an aroma that transported her to distant, almost forgotten memories. Memories of a warm lap and lullabies. "Is anyone there?" she whispered, turning her face in the direction of the perfume. Mrs. Higgins made a sound of surprise. "I only saw a blonde woman passing by quickly. She's always around here, you know. She watches the house from afar, but runs away when someone gets close." Ayla's heart leaped. That perfume. Could it be? But her thoughts were interrupted by a noise coming from the front of the house. Men arriving, many of them, their voices, mixing in a confusion of deep tones. "He's coming," someone shouted. "His car just entered the street above." Mrs. Higgins quickly walked away, her footsteps almost inaudible on the wet dirt. Ayla remained paralyzed, divided between the fear of what was about to happen and an inexplicable urge to find out more about the woman with the jasmine perfume. The sound of Barrett's car approaching made everyone on the street fall silent. Ayla could feel the tension in the air, as thick as the rain that continued to fall. Her father and his buddies were waiting outside, she knew, but there was something more. Other sounds, other cars approaching. "What the heck?" Joe from the bar's voice sounded confused. "Who are all these people?" Ayla approached the front window, her fingers brushing the worn curtain. The murmur outside had changed. Among the familiar voices of her father's friends, other voices emerged, female voices, elderly voices, children's voices. "We came to support Barrett," someone said loudly. It was Mr. Johnson from the convenience store. "Enough pretending we don't see what happens in this house." "That's right," another voice joined in. The teacher from the special needs school in the neighboring district. "We brought help for the girl and her father." The sound of footsteps on the sidewalk, dozens of them. The entire Oakhaven seemed to have taken to the streets, defying the rain and the fear. Ayla could feel the change in the air, the different energy emanating from the crowd. And then, amidst all that sound, that jasmine perfume returned, stronger now, closer. A stifled sob, hesitant steps, and a voice that made Ayla's world stop spinning. "Hank!" the female voice called, trembling but determined. "We need to talk about our daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. The rain continued to fall, but it seemed that all of Oakhaven had stopped breathing. Ayla felt her legs weaken, leaning against the wall to avoid falling. That voice? It couldn't be. "Clara?" Hank's voice came out strangled, unrecognizable. "But you're dead." "I saw the accident." "No, Hank." The voice was closer now. "You saw what you wanted to see. You saw what your guilt and your booze let you see." Ayla tried to process what was happening. Clara, her mother, was alive. The memories she kept were so fragmented, so distant. She remembered the jasmine perfume, gentle hands combing her hair, a soft voice singing her to sleep. And then, just silence and pain. All this time, Hank seemed to struggle with the words. "All this time, you were alive and didn't say anything. I tried to come back before." Clara's voice was choked. Many times, but you were always drunk, always violent. I was afraid of what you might do to her, to our Ayla. The murmurs of the crowd grew. Years of hushed stories, of unconfirmed suspicions began to come to light. Ayla could hear the neighbors' comments, pieces of a puzzle that were finally beginning to make sense. It was that night, wasn't it? Mrs. Higgins' voice stood out. The night of the accident, when you came home drunk and started breaking everything. Shut up, Hank shouted, but his voice was different. There was fear in it now. Nobody has any business meddling in my life. Clara died that night. Everyone knows that. No, Hank. It was Barrett who spoke now, his voice calm but firm. She didn't die. She ran away. She ran away to protect Ayla, to try to get help. But you made it impossible, didn't you? Spreading the story of her death, making everyone believe. Ayla felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. All those nights when her father cried, blaming her for her mother's death. All the times. He said she was just like her. Weren't just the words of a drunk. It was guilt. It was fear. The lady, Ayla whispered to herself. The lady who always watched from afar. The sound of footsteps approaching the door made her heart race. They weren't her father's heavy steps, nor Barrett's firm steps. It was a light, hesitant walk that she knew from somewhere very deep in her memory. Ayla, Clara's voice was on the other side of the door. My daughter, are you there? Tears began to run down Ayla's face, wetting her new glasses. Her hands were shaking so much that she could barely hold her cane. She wanted to run to the door. She wanted to scream. But years of fear kept her paralyzed. Get out of there. Hank's voice was out of control now. She's my daughter, mine. Sounds of confrontation came from the street, people moving, voices raised. Ayla could hear Barrett trying to calm the situation, the neighbors intervening, her father shouting louder and louder. Enough, Hank! Clara's voice gained a strength that Ayla had never heard before. Enough hurting our daughter, enough hurting yourself. Look what you've become, look what you've done to her. A heavy sound of something or someone falling. Then sobs. They weren't her father's usual drunken sobs. It was a different cry, deep, painful. I didn't want to. Hank's voice was unrecognizable. After you disappeared, I didn't know how. She's just like you, Clara. The same way, the same smile. I couldn't stand to look at her without remembering what you did to me that night. Clara completed, her voice softer now. What you could have done to her. Ayla felt something change in the air. It was as if a very old storm was finally coming to an end. The sounds outside began to make more sense. It was no longer a confrontation. It was a collapse. Hank needs help. It was the voice of a woman Ayla didn't know. I work at the recovery center for addicts. We can start today if you want. Ian Ayla. Barrett spoke again. She needs medical care, special school. I have all the necessary resources. I can help with all of that. Please, Hank's voice was almost fading. Please don't take her away from me too. Nobody is going to take anything from anyone, Clara replied firmly. But things need to change, Hank, here and now. Footsteps approached the bedroom door again. Ayla? It was her mother again. Can I come in, my daughter? Ayla took a step towards the door, then another. Her legs were trembling, but something inside her was stronger than fear. When her hand touched the doorknob, she realized that she was about to open not only a door, but a new chapter in her life. What she didn't know was that outside, an entire crowd was holding its breath. Barrett, with tears in his eyes, thought of his own sister, another child who didn't have the chance for a fresh start, and Clara, with her heart beating erratically, waited for the moment to be able, finally, to hug her daughter after so long. The doorknob turned slowly, and with it, the destiny of the entire Oakhaven began to change. The moment the door opened seemed to last an eternity. The smell of jasmine invaded the room with full force, bringing with it an avalanche of memories that Ayla had buried deep in her mind. Her fingers trembled on the doorknob as she tried to process all the sounds and sensations that surrounded her. "My girl." Clara's voice was so close now, charged with years of absence and contained longing. "You've grown so much." Ayla felt soft hands touching her face gently, gentle fingers tracing the contours of her bruises with a care she hadn't known for a long time. The touch was exactly as she remembered, tender, protective, full of a love that time couldn't erase. "Mom?" The word came out as a whisper, almost a prayer. Ayla reached out, finding Clara's face, mapping every detail with her fingertips as she did when she was little. She recognized the smooth curve of her chin, the high cheekbones, the delicate nose. It was really her. The hug that followed was like diving into deep waters after years in the desert. Ayla allowed herself to sink into the familiar warmth, into the perfume that she had so often smelled from afar, without knowing that it was her own mother who was watching her, helpless from the shadows. In the living room, Hank had sat down, on the old torn sofa, his head low in his hands. Barrett was beside him, speaking in a low voice with the social worker from the recovery center. The neighbors, still gathered outside, talked in whispered tones, as if fearing to break the magic of that moment. "Why?" The question escaped Ayla's lips before she could contain it. Why did it take so long? Clara held her daughter's hands in hers, her voice choked with emotion. "I tried, my love, so many times, but your father was getting worse and worse, more violent. I was afraid that if he saw me, if he knew I was alive, he could hurt you again," completed Mrs. Higgins, who watched the scene from the door. "We all saw how he got after that night, how the booze was consuming him." Ayla felt her mother shiver at hearing those words. More memories began to emerge. Distant screams, the sound of glass breaking, the strong smell of alcohol mixed with blood. "I should have been stronger," Clara continued, her voice just a whisper. "I should have found a way to get you out of here, but I had nowhere to go. I had no money. I had nobody. Until now," Barrett's firm voice sounded from the bedroom door. He had approached silently, watching the reunion with teary eyes. "Clara, as we agreed, there's an apartment waiting for you two, furnished, safe, near the special needs school where Ayla will be enrolled." "And me?" Hank's voice, coming from the living room, was unrecognizable, small, broken like that of a lost child. "What's going to become of me?" A heavy silence fell over the house. Ayla felt her mother tense, but it was Barrett who replied, "You have two options, Hank. You can continue down this path, losing everything that's left, or you can accept help. The rehab clinic is ready to receive you. 3 months of intensive treatment with psychological counseling. Afterwards, we can talk about supervised visits." 3 months? Hank let out a bitter laugh. "And my job? How am I going to pay for that?" "It's all settled," replied Barrett. "The treatment, the leave from work, everything. It just depends on you now." Ayla felt her mother move, getting up slowly. "Come on, honey, let's go talk to your father together." The path to the living room, which Ayla knew so well, seemed different now. Each step was like crossing years of pain and silence. The smell of alcohol was still present, but there was something else in the air, maybe hope. "Hank." Clara's voice was firm now. "Look at our daughter. Really look. Without the booze, without the anger. Look what we've done to her." Ayla heard a deep sob coming from the sofa. She smelled the salty scent of tears mixed with sweat and whiskey. "I don't even know who I am anymore, Clara," Hank murmured. "I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to fix things." "Nobody is asking you to fix everything at once," replied Barrett gently, "just to take the first step." It was then that something extraordinary happened. Ayla, gently releasing herself from her mother's embrace, took a step towards her father. Her fingers found his face, not to defend herself from a blow, as so many times before, but to feel the tears that were now flowing freely. "Dad?" she said, her voice small but clear. "I want my dad back too." The sob that Hank let out seemed to come from the depths of his soul. For the first time in years, there was no anger in his touch when he hugged his daughter, just regret, pain, and a love long buried under layers of alcohol and guilt. Outside, the rain was starting to subside. The afternoon sun tried to break through the clouds, casting beams of light through the dusty windows of house number 12. The entire Oakhaven seemed to breathe differently, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from its shoulders. At that moment, while a shattered family began to piece itself back together, something else was being born. A network of support, woven with the threads of compassion and courage that would extend far beyond that day, far beyond that street. What nobody knew yet was that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, full of obstacles that none of them could foresee. But now, at least, they were no longer alone on this journey. The first weeks after that rainy afternoon were the most difficult. Moving to the apartment that Barrett had provided was like entering a completely new world for Ayla. The rooms were spacious and airy, so different from the suffocating environment of house number 12. But the adaptation wasn't easy. Every unfamiliar noise, every change in routine made her cower, expecting an explosion of anger that would no longer come. Clara also struggled with her own demons. The nights were especially difficult when nightmares woke her up screaming, reliving that last night in Oakhaven. Ayla could hear her mother crying softly in the next room, and it was as if the roles had been reversed. Now it was she who wanted to protect, to comfort. "Mom," Ayla called out on one of those nights, feeling her way through the unfamiliar hallway. "Can I sleep with you?" The sound of hurried footsteps, a tight hug. "Of course, my love. Come here." Lying together in the new bed, mother and daughter slowly began to retell their stories, filling the gaps of the lost years. Clara spoke about how she fled that night, bleeding and scared, convinced that it was the only way to protect her daughter. "I had a plan," Clara whispered in the darkness. "I was going to get a job, save money, look for you. But your father spread that I was dead. And when I finally came back, he was so violent, I was so afraid of making everything worse. That's why you kept watching me from afar." "Every day," Clara replied, her voice choked. "There wasn't a day that I wasn't around. I tried to make sure you at least ate, left money with Mrs. Higgins to buy you food." It was then that Ayla understood. All those little miracles, the meals that appeared mysteriously, the warm clothes that appeared on the coldest days. It wasn't just the kindness of the neighbors. It was her mother, always present in the shadows, doing what little she could. Meanwhile, at the rehab clinic, Hank faced his own hells. Abstinence made him shake, scream, beg for a drop of alcohol. In the first days, his mind, free from the haze of booze, was flooded with memories that he had been trying to drown for years. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he repeated in the therapy sessions, his voice hoarse from crying so much. "What I did to my daughter, to Clara." The therapist, Dr. Marcus, a man with a calm voice and understanding eyes, listened patiently. "Forgiveness is not something that is earned, Hank. It's a gift we give ourselves when we decide to change." Barrett visited the clinic regularly, monitoring Hank's progress. Something in that family had touched an old wound in his heart, a pain he had carried since the death of his sister. "Do you know why I'm helping you?" Barrett asked Hank during one of those visits. "Because 20 years ago, my little sister needed someone like me, someone to interfere, to do something. She was blind too. She also suffered in silence, but nobody had the courage to get involved. Hank raised his eyes, red and swollen. What happened to her? She died, Barrett replied simply. Neglect. Nobody wanted to see the signs. Nobody wanted to get involved. When we finally discovered the truth, it was too late. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with mutual understanding. Two men, united by pain, by regret, but also by the possibility of redemption. At the special needs school where Isla began to study, the challenges were different. Used to living in the shadows, she had difficulty interacting with the other children. Her body still tensed at the slightest loud sound, her fingers instinctively searching for the old cane when she felt threatened. She has a lot of potential, commented the teacher Helen during a meeting with Clara and Barrett. But the trauma, it will take time for her to trust, to open up. It was on one of those mornings at school that something unexpected happened. During music class, when the teacher began to play the piano, Ayla felt something awaken inside her. Her fingers began to move on their own, as if they knew the keys she had never touched. My mother used to play the piano, she said softly, surprising everyone. I remember she played for me to sleep. Clara, who was watching the class from afar, felt the tears running down. It was the only thing that calmed you down as a baby, she explained later. Even after we had to sell the piano, I still sang the melodies to you. Music became a bridge between past and present, a form of healing that no one had foreseen. The school had an old piano in the main hall, and Ayla began to take extra lessons. Her small hands, once tense with fear, now glided over the keys with a natural grace. But it wasn't all progress. There were difficult days when the weight of the past seemed impossible to carry. Clara still woke up startled by nightmares. Ayla still had panic attacks, and the news coming from the clinic wasn't always encouraging. Your father had a relapse yesterday, Barrett informed gently one afternoon. It happens, it's part of the process. He's feeling very guilty, wanting to give up on the treatment. Ayla's heart squeezed. Despite everything, despite all the pain, a part of her still loved her father. Not the man who hurt her, but the one who sometimes appeared in the rare moments of sobriety, the father she knew existed under layers of alcohol and bitterness. Can I visit him? She asked, surprising everyone. Maybe if he hears me play the piano. The suggestion caught everyone off guard. Clara paled. Barrett frowned worriedly. But there was something in Ayla's determination, a strength that was beginning to sprout from the cracks of her fear, that made everyone think twice. What no one could predict was that simple request, that little girl's desire to play the piano for her father in recovery, would be the catalyst for even deeper changes. Changes that would affect not only that fragmented family, but the entire community around them. As night fell on the city, Ayla practiced on the school piano, her fingers finding melodies that spoke of pain, of forgiveness, and of hope. Across town, in his cell at the rehab clinic, Hank looked out the window, holding the token for a day without drinking, thinking about the daughter who, despite everything, still wanted music in his life. The day of the visit to the rehab clinic dawned cloudy. Ayla woke up before sunrise, her hands sweating cold as she prepared. Clara helped her get dressed in silence, trying to hide the tremor in her own hands. The light blue dress that Barrett had bought for the occasion still had the tag on it. It was the first time Ayla had received a new outfit. Are you sure you want to do this, honey? Clara asked for the 10th time, adjusting the ribbon in the girl's hair. Nobody will judge you if you change your mind, Ayla nodded, gripping her cane tighter. I need to do this, Mom, for me and for him. The journey to the clinic was made in silence. Barrett drove slowly, casting worried glances in the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Ayla kept her head up, but her fingers didn't stop playing with the hem of her new dress. The clinic wasn't what Ayla had imagined. There was no smell of hospital, nor that oppressive silence that frightened her so much. The air was perfumed with lavender, and she could hear birds singing in the gardens. A kind lady greeted them at the reception, her soft voice explaining the procedures. "Your father is looking forward to seeing you," said the receptionist. "He didn't sleep all night, you know. He was arranging the music. Room especially for you." Those words caught everyone off guard. Clara held her breath, and Barrett made a low sound of approval. Ayla felt something warm grow in her chest. Her father had remembered the piano. Dr. Marcus met them in the hallway. "We prepared everything as requested," he explained. "The piano is tuned, and Hank is having a good day. But if at any moment you want to stop—" "I'm not going to stop," Ayla interrupted with a firmness that surprised everyone. Not this time. The music room was spacious, with large windows that let in the diffused morning light. The smell of polished wood and something else, fresh coffee, filled the room. And then Ayla heard the heavy and familiar breathing, the hesitant steps, the slight creaking of the chair. "Ayla!" Hank's voice was different. There was no more slurring of drunken words, nor the harsh tone of anger. It was a broken voice, but clean. "Is that really you, honey?" She took a step forward, guided by the sound. Her fingers found the piano first, an old instrument, but well cared for. The wooden bench creaked slightly when she sat down. "Hi, Dad." Her voice came out firmer than she expected. "I brought something for you to hear." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of the keys being played. Ayla started slowly, finding the notes of a song her mother used to play. A simple melody, almost a lullaby. That's when it happened. A sob, deep and painful, came from the direction where Hank was sitting. "That song," he managed to say through tears, "your mother used to play when you were a baby." The notes continued to flow, becoming more and more secure. Ayla could feel the presence of everyone in the room, her mother crying silently. In a corner, Barrett leaning against the wall, Dr. Marcus watching attentively, and her father, who for the first time in years was really listening to her. "We had a piano at home," Hank said, his voice choked. Before I messed everything up. Your mother gave lessons to supplement the income. Remember, Clara?" "I remember," Clara replied softly. "You bought that piano yourself, Hank. Worked overtime for months." The music stopped for a moment. Ayla felt the tears running down behind her dark glasses. "Why did you sell it, Dad?" The sound of footsteps, Hank getting up, approaching slowly. "To buy booze, honey. I sold everything, the piano, our dignity, your childhood, but every time I drank I could pretend I didn't remember the music, of your mother playing, of how I destroyed our family." Ayla started playing again, now. A different melody, something she had been composing in her head for days, a song that spoke of pain, but also of hope. That's new," Clara whispered, recognizing that it wasn't one of the old songs she used to play. "It's mine," Ayla replied without stopping playing. "I made it thinking about us, about the three of us." It was as if something broke inside the room. Hank fell to his knees beside the piano, his sobs now uncontrollable. Clara approached slowly, years of fear, fighting against the instinct to comfort that man who, before the booze, before the violence, had been the love of her life. "Forgive me," Hank repeated through tears. "Forgive me, forgive me." Ayla's hands left the piano, finding their way to her father's face. As she had done so many times before, her fingers mapped his features. But now they weren't looking for signs of anger or drunkenness. They were looking for the father she knew existed under all those layers of pain. "You look different," she said softly. "Your face is lighter." 45 days without drinking," he replied, holding his daughter's small hands in his. "Every day is a struggle, but when they told me you wanted to play for me, I knew I couldn't give up. Dr. Marcus made a discreet sign to Barrett, and the two left the room silently, leaving the family in that precious moment of reconnection. Outside, the doctor smiled. "You know," he commented, "in 20 years of treating addicts, I've learned that the cure rarely comes from medicines or therapies. It comes from love, from forgiveness, from the music that a blind girl composes for the father who is trying to find his way back home." Inside the room, Ayla started playing again. Now Clara joined them, her soft voice finding the melody, adding words that spoke of new beginnings. Hank, still on his knees, cried, but they were different tears now. Tears of someone who begins to see a future beyond the darkness. What none of them knew was that that moment would be just the beginning. That music, born of pain, but transformed into hope, would echo far beyond that room, far beyond that clinic. That other broken families would hear their story and find the courage to seek help. As the sun finally broke through the clouds outside, illuminating the room through the large windows, 3 wounded hearts began to beat in the same rhythm again. The rhythm of a new music, a new story, a new beginning. The weeks that followed the visit to the clinic brought subtle but significant changes. Ayla began to smile more, her fingers now seeking the piano keys with eagerness instead of fear. At the special needs school, teacher Helen noticed that the girl was more participative, even befriending Marina, a newly arrived girl who was also learning the piano. Clara, in turn, faced her own battles. One particularly difficult morning, while sorting through some boxes they had brought from Oakhaven, she found an old photo, her, Hank, and Ayla as a baby, sitting at the piano. The image hit her like a punch in the stomach. "Mom!" Ayla called, from the next room, sensing the change in Clara's breathing. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, my love." Laura tried to disguise her choked voice, but Ayla was already at the door, her cane finding its way easily through the apartment she now knew so well. "You're crying," Ayla stated, her fingers gently touching her mother's face. "Is it because of Dad?" Clara held her daughter's hand, guiding her to sit beside her. "I found an old photo from the time when we were happy, you know. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, running away like that. Can I know what happened that night?" Ayla asked hesitantly. It was the first time she had the courage to question directly about the past. Clara took a deep breath, holding the photo tightly. "Your father had lost his job that week. He was drinking more than usual. I had gotten some piano students. I was giving lessons at home to help with the bills. But—" her voice failed for a moment, the painful memories coming back with full force. "That night he came home distraught. He said I was showing off to the students, that the piano was more important than him. He started breaking everything, threw a bottle. I dodged it, but the glass—" Ayla squeezed her mother's hand, feeling the old scars she had never noticed before. "Is that when you ran away?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "You were sleeping. I was bleeding a lot. I was terrified. I thought that if I stayed, he could hurt you too. So I ran, without direction, without plans. When I finally got help, your father had already spread that I was dead." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the doorbell. It was Barrett, arriving for the weekly visit that had become routine. He brought news from the clinic and, more importantly, a surprise that would change everything. "I brought something special today," he announced, his smile evident in his voice. "Actually, 2 surprises. The first is that your father has completed 60 days of sobriety." Ayla smiled, proud. Clara wiped away her tears discreetly, trying to hide the emotion that the news provoked. "And the second surprise," Barrett continued, a touch of mystery in his voice. "Well, this one is bigger. Remember I mentioned wanting to do something for the community, something that could help other families?" He took some papers out of his folder, handing them to Clara. I bought a space near here. It was an old music school that had been closed. For years, I'm renovating everything and I want to turn it into a cultural center with music lessons for underprivileged children, especially those with visual impairments. Like your sister? Ayla asked softly, remembering the story she had heard about Barrett's sister. Yes, he replied, his voice faltering slightly. Sophia loved music. I always thought that if she had had the chance to study, to express herself through art, maybe her story would have been different. Clara studied the papers with growing attention. But it's a huge project, Barrett. It must cost a fortune. Money I have, he replied simply. What I need is people who understand the importance of this. People who can help other families who are going through what you went through. He paused significantly before continuing. That's why I wanted to invite you, Clara, to be our piano teacher. And Ayla, well, I thought you could be our first student monitor. The proposal fell like a bombshell of emotions in the small apartment. Clara dropped the papers, her hands trembling. Ayla remained still, processing the idea of being able to help other children through music. But I haven't taught in years, Clara protested weakly. And Ayla, she's still learning. Exactly, that's why, Barrett interrupted gently. You know what it's like to start from scratch. You know how music can be a form of healing. And there's more. He hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. I talked to the team at the clinic. When your father completes the treatment, if he maintains sobriety, they suggest that he could also participate in the project, not as a teacher, of course, but helping with the administration, using his experience in construction to oversee the maintenance of the space. The mention of Hank made the air thick in the apartment. Clara got up, walking to the window, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Ayla remained seated, her fingers drumming silently in her lap, as if playing an invisible piano. What if... Clara began, her voice almost a whisper. What if he can't do it? If he goes back to drinking? Then we'll deal with it, Barrett replied firmly. But we can't live in fear of what might go wrong. Your daughter taught me that. Ayla got up then, walking safely to her mother. Her little fingers found Clara's face, wiping away the tears she hadn't even realized were falling. Mom, she said softly. Remember what you always told me when I was little? That music has the power to heal broken hearts. Clara sobbed quietly, hugging her daughter. I remember, my love, I remember every word. So, Ayla continued, her voice gaining strength, maybe it's time to prove that's true, not just for us, but for everyone who needs help. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It wasn't a silence of fear or hesitation, but of possibilities opening up, of futures being redesigned, of songs not yet written waiting to be played. Barrett watched the scene with teary eyes, thinking of Sophia, of how she would have loved to see this moment, of how in some way her death hadn't been in vain. It had planted the seed that was now beginning to bloom. The old music school building was larger than Clara had imagined. Their footsteps echoed through the empty hallways as Barrett showed the space, describing every detail to Ayla, who walked between them, holding her cane with one hand and the other firmly gripped to her mother's skirt. This will be the main hall, Barrett explained, his voice reverberating in the wide space. I've already ordered 3 pianos, but we need to decide where to place them. Clara, what do you think? Clara walked through the hall slowly, her fingers brushing the peeling walls. Memories of her own time as a piano teacher came back in waves. And then the smell of polished wood, the sound of scales being practiced, the laughter of children. There, she pointed to a corner illuminated by a large window. The morning sun will be perfect for the initial classes, and on the other side, near that column, for the more advanced students. And the third one? Barrett asked, watching Ayla. who had separated from them and walked alone through the hall, her steps becoming more and more secure. "In the center," Ayla replied before her mother could speak. "For presentations. I can feel the acoustics from here. It will be perfect." Clara and Barrett exchanged surprised looks. Ayla's confidence increased every day, as if each new achievement freed her a little more from the fear that had imprisoned her for so long. "There's one more thing I want to show you," Barrett said, guiding them through a side corridor. "This will be the special practice room." Upon opening the door, Clara let out an exclamation of surprise. The room was smaller than the main hall, but perfectly adapted. Padded walls for better acoustics, floor with raised markings for guidance, and in the center. It's our piano," Clara whispered, immediately recognizing the instrument that had been sold so many years ago. "How?" she managed to ask, her voice choked with emotion. "It wasn't easy to find," Barrett admitted. "I spent months tracking down buyers, antique dealers. But when I finally located it, I knew I had to. Bring it back." Ayla approached the piano as if drawn by a magnet. Her fingers delicately ran over the old wood, finding every mark, every familiar imperfection. "There's a crack here," she said softly, "right in the right corner." "You remember?" Clara asked, surprised. "Not exactly," Ayla replied, continuing her tactile exploration. "But my fingers remember. It's like they never forgot." The moment was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Dr. Marcus appeared at the door, accompanied by a figure that made Clara instinctively take a step back. Hank. He was different. It wasn't just the 70 days of sobriety that marked the change. There was something more in his eyes, a clarity that had long been lost in the fog of alcohol. Can I come in?" he asked hesitantly, remaining in the doorway. The silence that followed was tense. Clara unconsciously placed herself between Hank and Ayla, a reflection of years of protecting her daughter. But it was Ayla who broke the impasse. "Dad!" she called, still with her hands on the piano. "Come here, I want to show you something." Hank entered the room as if walking on eggshells, each movement measured and cautious. Dr. Marcus and Barrett exchanged meaningful looks. It was the first time the family had met outside the controlled environment of the clinic. "Do you recognize it?" Ayla asked, indicating the piano. Hank approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the instrument. "How not to recognize it?" His voice came out hoarse. "I saved for a year to buy it for your mother." Remember the day it arrived? Clara surprised everyone by speaking. "You had just been promoted to foreman, and you cried when you saw it," Hank completed, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Said it was too big for our small apartment." "But it fit perfectly," Clara continued, her voice softening, as if it had been made for that space. The tension in the room began to gradually decrease, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of nostalgia, regret, and perhaps hope. "Play us a song, Ayla," Barrett suggested gently. The girl nodded, sitting at the piano with a naturalness that surprised everyone. Her fingers found the keys as if they had never separated from them. The melody she began to play was new, something she had composed in recent weeks. It was a music different from all she had created. It started softly, almost hesitant, like the first rays of sunshine after a long night. Gradually it grew, gaining strength, intertwining themes that seemed to tell a story. Her story. Clara recognized fragments of old lullabies mixed into the composition. Hank, leaning against the far wall, closed his eyes, the notes bringing back memories of happier times, of promises made and broken, of lost loves, and perhaps of the possibility of redemption. When the music ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Dr. Marcus discreetly wiped away the tears, while Barrett looked out the window, trying to hide his own emotion. "What do you call that song?" Clara asked softly. Ayla smiled, her fingers still caressing the keys. "Rebirth," she replied simply. It was then that Hank did something no one expected. He approached the piano, kneeling beside the bench where Ayla was sitting. With trembling hands, he took something out of his pocket, a token from the clinic, marking 70 days of sobriety. "Honey," his voice was choked. "I know I don't deserve it, but is there room in this rebirth for me too?" The silence that followed seemed to contain the weight of all the lost years, all the tears shed, all the broken dreams. But it also contained something more, the possibility of healing, of forgiveness, of a future different from the past that had hurt them so much. Ayla reached out, finding her father's face with that gentle touch that was only hers. "There always has been, Dad," she replied softly. "You just needed to want to come back." Clara watched the scene with her heart beating erratically. There was still a long road ahead, she knew. Trust needed to be rebuilt brick by brick, day after day. But there, in that room with the piano that had been a witness to so many moments of their lives, something was beginning to change. The afternoon sun entered through the window, bathing the environment with a golden light. In the hallway, the workers were already beginning to work on the renovation of the building. Soon those empty rooms would be filled with music, with hope, with other families seeking their own new beginnings. But at that moment, in that room, it was just a family trying to rebuild the pieces of a love that, despite everything, had never ceased to exist. The days that followed the meeting at the music school brought with them a different routine. The mornings were dedicated to Ayla's classes at the special school, where she continued to progress not only in music, but also in Braille and other subjects. The afternoons were divided between monitoring the renovation of the cultural center and the supervised visits with Hank, which now took place 3 times a week. Clara watched each change with a mixture of hope and apprehension. It was difficult to let go of the fear that had become her constant companion for so many years. Even seeing the transformations in Hank, even recognizing the genuine effort he made to stay sober, a part of her still tensed when he got too close. One particularly hot afternoon, while overseeing the installation of the pianos in the main hall, Clara was surprised by a conversation she didn't expect to hear. "Dad's different, isn't he?" Ayla commented, sitting beside her while the workers moved the instruments. "His voice doesn't tremble like before." Clara looked at her daughter, surprised by the observation. It was true. Hank's slurred and unstable voice had given way to a firmer tone, more like the man she had met so many years ago. "It is," she replied cautiously, "but it's still early, honey. We need to have patience." "I know," Ayla completed, a small smile playing on her lips. "You always say that, but you know what I think? That sometimes we need to have courage too." The wisdom of those words, coming from a child who had lived so much in so little time, struck Clara like lightning. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Barrett, who brought important news. "The cultural center is almost ready," he announced, sitting with them. "I thought we'd do a small opening presentation, something simple just for the community." Presentation. Clara felt a chill in her stomach. It had been so long since she had performed in public. "Yes," Barrett continued, his enthusiasm evident. "You and Ayla could play together. And, well, Hank asked to help with the organization. He knows a lot of people in the construction industry who have children with special needs." The silence that followed was heavy. Clara could feel the weight of the decision she needed to make. It wasn't just about a presentation. It was about taking a step beyond fear, about trusting again. "I want to," Ayla declared firmly, "and I want it to be that new song I'm composing, the one that talks about our family." "But it's not ready yet," Clara protested weakly. "Exactly," Ayla smiled, "because it's missing your part in it, Mom, and Dad's too." At that moment, as if it had been arranged, Hank appeared at the door of the hall. He was wearing a simple work uniform, carrying some tools. He had gotten a temporary job helping with the renovation under the strict supervision of Barrett. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly. "I just came to check the electrical installation of the spotlights that will illuminate the pianos." Clara watched while he worked, his precise and careful movements so different from the brutality of before. He had lost weight, his face was rosier, and his eyes, before always red and blurred, now had a glimmer of determination. "Dad?" Ayla called, her voice echoing in the almost empty hall. "Remember when you used to sing me to sleep?" Hank stopped what he was doing, his hands trembling slightly. "I remember," he replied with a hoarse voice. "You always asked for that song. What was it called?" "Lullaby," Clara replied automatically, surprising everyone, including herself. "You sang it every night, even after a whole day of hard work." "Do you still know how to sing?" Ayla asked, a touch of hope in her voice. Hank cleared his throat, visibly moved. "It's been so long. I don't know if—" "Try," Ayla insisted softly, her hands finding the piano keys. "I'll start, and you come in when you remember." The first notes of Lullaby filled the hall. It was a simple melody, but loaded with memories. Clara felt her heart squeeze as she recognized the song that had rocked so many nights of her family before everything fell apart. And then, hesitant at first, Hank's voice joined the melody. It was hoarse, a little out of tune, but it was still the same voice that had put her daughter to sleep so many times. Clara closed her eyes, letting the memories come back. Not the bad ones, but the good ones, those she had kept in the depths of her heart. Without realizing it, she also began to sing. Her voice, trained by years of music lessons, naturally found harmony with Hank's. It was as if the years of separation had disappeared for a moment, leaving only the music and the memories of happier times. Barrett watched the scene with tears in his eyes, thinking of his own sister, of how she would have loved to see this moment of healing through music. The workers had stopped their tasks, some also visibly moved. When the music ended, the silence that followed was no longer heavy or tense. It was a silence full of possibilities, of forgiveness, of hope. "That's it," Ayla said softly, her hands still on the keys. "That's how the new song has to end, with the three of us together." Clara looked at Hank, who had teary eyes. He was no longer the monster who had made her run away that terrible night, but he was also no longer the young dreamer she had married. He was someone new, someone who was struggling to rebuild himself day after day. "Okay," she finally agreed, "let's do this presentation together." The smile that lit up Ayla's face was like a ray of sunshine after a long storm. Barrett discreetly walked away, leaving the family in that precious moment of reconnection. What none of them knew was that that decision would be just the beginning of an even greater transformation, not only for them, but for the entire community that would soon fill those rooms with music, hope, and stories of rebirth. The week leading up to the opening of the cultural center was intense. Clara spent hours at the piano, relearning to trust her fingers, letting the music flow naturally after so long. Ayla was radiant, dividing her time between rehearsals and classes at the special school, where her teacher noticed impressive changes in her behavior. "She's blossoming," commented Helen during a meeting with Clara. "It's not just the music, it's like she's finally allowed to be a child." The teacher's words echoed in Clara's mind throughout that afternoon. Watching Ayla rehearse, she realized how different her daughter really was. The constant fear that once seemed to envelop her every movement had given way to a soft, almost luminous confidence. One Thursday, 3 days before the opening, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Higgins appeared at the Cultural Center, accompanied by several residents of Oakhaven. Among them, familiar faces that for years had been silent, witnesses to the drama of that family. "We came to help," announced Mrs. Higgins with her characteristic simplicity. "Everyone brought what they could. Mr. Johnson from the convenience store will provide the snacks for the opening. Mrs. Miller from the bakery is making the cakes." Clara felt the tears spring to her eyes as she saw those people. The same. Ones who for so long had closed their windows, averted their gazes, now mobilizing to help. It was as if the music had awakened something in the community, a desire to be part of that rebirth. "And that's not all," continued Mrs. Higgins, her eyes shining with emotion. "We made a list of children in the neighborhood who need help. There's Maria, who is deaf but loves to dance. Little Peter, who has Down syndrome and bangs on all the pots as if they were drums." Barrett, who was watching the scene, immediately began to take notes. His initial project for a cultural center was beginning to expand, embracing needs he hadn't even imagined initially. In the midst of all that movement, Hank worked silently, installing the last lights, checking every detail of the structure. 90 days of sobriety had changed not only his appearance, but his way of seeing the world. Each task was executed with an almost reverential care, as if through the well-done work he could, in some way, begin to repair the damage he had caused. "Dad?" Ayla's voice called him as he adjusted a spotlight. "Can I ask you something?" Hank climbed down the ladder carefully, approaching his daughter. He was still surprised every time she called him Dad. It was as if he didn't deserve that title after everything he had done. "Of course, honey," he replied, his voice carrying that new softness that still sounded strange to his own ears. "At the presentation..." Ayla hesitated for a moment, her fingers playing with the hem of her dress. "I wanted you to sing too. Not the whole lullaby, just a piece in the new part of the song I made." The request caught Hank off guard. "But your mother, I don't know if she..." "I talked to her," Ayla interrupted gently. "She said the decision is yours." Clara, who was close enough to hear the conversation, felt her heart squeeze. It was true. She had said the decision was Hank's. What she hadn't been able to say was that secretly she also wanted to hear his voice join the music again. "I don't know if I deserve it," Hank murmured, more to himself than to others. It was then that Mrs. Higgins, who was still nearby, did something surprising. She approached Hank with that determination that only older ladies seem to have. "Deserve," she said, her words loaded with a simple but profound wisdom. "Nobody deserves anything in this life, Hank. We just receive the chances that God puts in our path. And when we receive a chance like this," she pointed to Ayla, to the piano, to all the space around, "we don't question, we thank and earn it." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of footsteps. More residents of Oakhaven arriving, bringing chairs, flowers, musical instruments. The cultural center seemed to gain a life of its own, as if the entire community had decided to be part of that story. "So," Ayla insisted, a small smile playing on her lips, "are you going to sing?" Hank looked at his daughter, at Clara, who watched from a distance, at all those people who, in some way, were giving him a second chance. He remembered Dr. Marcus's words at the clinic. Recovery is not just about stopping drinking. It's about rebuilding bridges, regaining trust, one day at a time. "I will," he replied finally, his voice choked, "if you teach me the new part." Ayla's smile lit up her entire face. Without hesitating, she took her father's hand and guided him to the piano, where she began to play the melody she had composed. It was a music that spoke of pain, of forgiveness, of new beginnings, their story transformed into musical notes. Clara watched the scene with her heart beating erratically. There was still so much fear inside her, so many scars. But seeing her daughter teach her father to sing again, she realized that perhaps the real miracle wasn't in the music itself, but in what it was doing with all of them. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. The last rays entered through the windows of the hall, illuminating the piano where father and daughter rehearsed. In 2 days, that space would be filled with people, with stories, with hope. But at that moment, in that golden light of the late afternoon, it was just a family learning to make music together again. And maybe, thought Clara as she approached the piano, this was the most beautiful new beginning of all. The morning of the opening dawned with a soft drizzle of those that seem more like a blessing than an inconvenience. Clara woke up before the alarm clock, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared the coffee. In the next room, she could hear Ayla already awake, her fingers drumming on the mattress, silently rehearsing the scores she knew by heart. "Mom!" Ayla called, her voice still sleepy. "What time is it?" "It's still early, my love," Clara replied, entering her daughter's room. "It's barely past 6. I can't sleep," Ayla confessed, sitting on the bed. "I keep thinking, what if I make a mistake? What if Dad—" Clara sat down next to her daughter, stroking her still disheveled hair. It was the first time Ayla had shown insecurity since they had started rehearsing. "Do you know what your grandmother always told me before performances?" Clara asked softly. "That music isn't about hitting all the notes. It's about playing with your heart." "You never talk about Grandma," Ayla commented, turning her face towards her mother. "What was she like?" Clara took a deep breath. Memories long kept coming to the surface. "She was pure music. She gave piano lessons at the neighborhood church, but didn't charge the children who couldn't pay. She said music was a gift from God. It couldn't be denied to anyone. Was it she who taught you to play?" "It was," Clara smiled at the memory. "And it was she who taught me that sometimes the greatest changes begin with a simple melody." The sound of the doorbell interrupted the conversation. It was too early for visitors, but upon opening the door, Clara found Mrs. Higgins carrying a basket of still warm breads. "I brought breakfast for you," the lady announced, entering without ceremony. "Today is a special day. No one will perform on an empty stomach." Right behind her, other people from Oakhaven began to arrive. Mrs. Miller from the bakery with her freshly baked cakes, Mr. Johnson from the convenience store carrying fresh fruit. Even old Joe from the newspaper stand showed up with a simple bouquet of flowers. "We wanted to make a surprise," explained Mrs. Higgins, seeing Clara's emotional look, "to prepare you for the big day." In a few minutes, the small kitchen of the apartment was full. Ayla, sitting at the table, smiled as she heard the familiar voices, the clinking of cups, the hum of conversations and laughter. It was as if a piece of Oakhaven had moved there. "Where's Hank?" someone asked. "He's coming, right?" "He's coming straight from the clinic," Clara replied, surprising herself with the naturalness of the answer. "Dr. Marcus is bringing him." The breakfast turned into a small celebration. While they ate, the neighbors shared stories from the past. Memories of the times when Hank and Clara were newlyweds, of the first piano performances she gave at home. "I remember when little Ayla was born," Mrs. Miller commented, her eyes watering. "Hank went out distributing sweets throughout the street. He was so proud." Clara felt a lump in her throat. Those memories hurt in a different way now, no longer as open wounds, but as scars that were beginning to heal. Around 9 o'clock, Barrett arrived. He stopped at the door, observing the unusual scene. The small kitchen crowded with people, the smell of coffee and fresh bread, the laughter and conversations mixing. "I came to pick up our stars," he announced with a smile, "but I see they're already being well taken care of." The arrival at the cultural center was another moment of surprise. The place was unrecognizable. Flowers decorated every corner, colorful ribbons hung from the ceiling, and in the main hall, the 3 pianos shone under the light that entered through the windows, now clean and polished. "We made a special decoration," explained Mrs. Higgins, who had come along in Barrett's car. "The children of Oakhaven helped make the ribbons, the arrangements. Ayla walked through the space, touching every detail, her sensitive fingers capturing the affection printed on every decoration. When she reached the central piano, she stopped, taking a deep breath. "There are more people coming," she commented, her keen hearing capturing movements outside. It was true. Little by little, the cultural center began to fill up. Entire families arrived, many bringing children with special needs. Clara recognized some faces, parents of students from the special school where Ayla studied, residents of Oakhaven, even some of her former piano students. And then, shortly before 10 o'clock, a car parked in front of the building. Dr. Marcus got out first, opening the door for Hank. He was wearing a simple but clean and well-pressed suit, an outfit that Barrett had provided especially for the occasion. Clara watched through the window as he got out of the car. His movements were different now, more controlled, more dignified. 90 days of sobriety had returned something that alcohol had stolen a long time ago: his humanity. "Dad!" Ayla called, recognizing his steps even among so many other sounds. The meeting of the three, father, mother, and daughter, in the middle of the main hall was witnessed in respectful silence by all those present. They were no longer the shattered family from house number 12. They were three people who, despite all the scars, were learning to make music together again. "It's time," Barrett announced softly. As people took their places, Clara looked at her family, at Ayla, who smiled with a confidence she had never seen before, at Hank, who trembled slightly but kept his head up, and at herself, reflected in the black and shining piano, where in a few minutes her hands would tell a story of pain, forgiveness, and rebirth. The music she was about to play wasn't just theirs. It was of everyone who was there. Each person, carrying their own stories of struggle, their own scars, their own dreams of a new beginning. The hall was completely full when Barrett went up to the small makeshift stage. The murmur of conversations gradually decreased until it turned into an expectant silence. Through the window, the drizzle had given way to a shy sun that seemed to dance among the clouds. "Today is not just the opening of a cultural center," Barrett began, his deep voice echoing through the environment. "It's the celebration of something much bigger. It's proof that music has the power to heal, to transform, to rebuild what was broken." His eyes ran through the audience, finding familiar and unfamiliar faces. In the first row, Dr. Marcus smiled, discreetly. Next to him, Helen, Ayla's teacher, held the hand of one of her students, Maria, the deaf girl who felt the music through the vibrations. "Many years ago," Barrett continued, his voice faltering slightly, "I lost my sister Sophia. She was blind too, she also loved music. But back then, we didn't have the chance we're having today. We didn't have an entire community coming together to make a difference." On the side of the hall, Clara adjusted Ayla's dress, a light blue model, simple but elegant, that matched what she herself was wearing. Hank kept close, his restless hands adjusting the tie he barely knew how to use. "That's why," Barrett continued, "this place isn't just a cultural center. It's a space of hope, of new beginnings, and nothing could symbolize this better than the presentation we'll see today." He paused, turning to where the family was. "Ayla, Clara, and Hank, please." The moment when the three walked to the pianos seemed to happen in slow motion. Clara sat at the piano on the right, Ayla at the central one, while Hank remained standing next to his daughter. The silence in the hall was so deep that you could hear the nervous breathing of the three. Ayla was the first to play. Her fingers found the keys with a confidence that came not only from the rehearsals, but from something deeper, an intimate understanding of the music that transcended technique. The melody began softly, almost hesitant, like the first rays of sunshine after a long night. Clara came in next, her hands dancing over the keys of the second piano, adding layers of harmony that intertwined with her daughter's music. It was as if the two were talking through the notes, telling a story that words could not express. The music grew, gaining body and depth. In the audience, some people were already crying silently. Mrs. Higgins, sitting among her neighbours from Oakhaven, held a handkerchief against her eyes, while Mr. Johnson from the convenience store tried to disguise his own tears. And then, in the most intense moment of the music, when the melodies of the two pianos seemed to reach their apex, something extraordinary happened. Hank's voice, that same voice that for years had been distorted by alcohol and anger, rose clear and strong. It was the lullaby, not the full version, but just the chorus, those few lines that he had sung to Ayla to sleep so many times. His voice trembled slightly at first, but it gained firmness, finding its place among the notes of the pianos. Clara felt her heart skip a beat. That voice, it was the same one that had enchanted her so many years ago, when Hank was still a young, dreamy construction worker who sang while he worked. The same voice that had rocked the first years of Ayla's life, before everything fell apart. The music continued to develop, the three parts intertwining in a delicate and powerful dance. It wasn't just a performance. It was a story being told through notes and melodies. The story of a family that had gotten lost in the shadows and was finding its way back through music. In the audience, Barrett watched with teary eyes, thinking of Sophia. How she would have loved to be there. How she would have been proud to see his dream of an inclusive space for music becoming reality. Maria, the deaf girl, had her eyes closed, her small hands touching the nearest piano, feeling the vibrations of the music running through her body. Next to her, other special needs children watched in wonder, each experiencing the music in their own way. The composition gradually came to an end, like a river flowing into the sea. The last notes lingered in the air for a moment that seemed eternal, a moment in which past, present, and future seemed to exist simultaneously. When silence finally returned, no one moved immediately. It was as if everyone needed a moment to process what they had just witnessed. It was Ayla who broke the spell, rising from the piano with a radiant smile. Her outstretched arms found first her father, then her mother, pulling them into a hug that just months before would have been unthinkable. The audience erupted in applause. People stood up, tears ran freely, hugs were exchanged. It wasn't just a family that was being celebrated there. It was the possibility of transformation, of redemption, of a new beginning. But something was still to happen, something that no one, not even Barrett with all his careful planning, could have foreseen. Something that would forever change not only the story of that family, but of the entire community. While the applause still echoed through the hall, a figure stood out from the crowd, walking towards the stage with determined steps. The figure approaching the stage was an elderly lady, her snow-white hair tied in an elegant bun. She wore a simple but well-cared-for dress, and in her trembling hands she held something that appeared to be an envelope yellowed by time. Clara was the first to notice her, and her face paled as if she had seen a ghost. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the last applause that still echoed through the hall. Ayla felt the change in the atmosphere immediately. "Grandma?" she asked, her head turning towards the sound of the approaching footsteps. Footsteps that in some way seemed strangely familiar to her. The lady, Grandma Cecilia, climbed onto the stage with a dignity that her 80 years hadn't been able to diminish. Her eyes, the same honey color as Clara's, were watering. "My daughter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's been so long." The silence that fell over the hall was almost palpable. Hank took a step back, as if he didn't feel worthy of participating in that moment, but Grandma Cecilia stopped him with a gesture. "No, Hank, you need to hear this. 2. She opened the envelope carefully, taking out some old sheets of paper and a photograph. In the image, yellowed by time, a young Clara smiled at the piano, while a younger Hank watched her with adoration. "I've kept this all these years," Grandma Cecilia began, "waiting for the right moment, waiting for the music to bring you back. But you," Clara stammered, confused. "After that night when I ran away, you never—" "I knew where you were, honey," Grandma Cecilia interrupted softly. "I always knew. I was the one who left money with Mrs. Higgins to buy food for Ayla. I was the one who secretly paid the bar tabs so that Hank wouldn't sink even deeper into debt." The revelation hit everyone like a wave. Mrs. Higgins, in the audience, wiped away tears while nodding, confirming silently. "But why?" Clara asked, her voice choked. "Why didn't you reveal yourself before?" "Because some people need to find their own way back," replied the lady, her eyes now fixed on Hank. "We can't force healing, we can't rush forgiveness. Everything has its time." She turned then to Ayla, her wrinkled hands finding her granddaughter's face with infinite tenderness. "And you, my little musician, you were the instrument that God used to bring this family back." Ayla smiled through the tears that were now running freely down her face. There was something in her grandmother's touch that awakened very old memories. The smell of talcum powder and lavender, the distant sound of a piano, a soft voice singing lullabies. "Do you also play the piano?" she asked curiously. "Grandma," Cecilia laughed softly. "Who do you think taught your mother? Music is in our blood, dear. It passes from generation to generation, like a sacred gift." She turned then to the audience, her voice gaining strength. "This place," she gestured to the hall around, "isn't just a cultural center. It's a testament that love, when fueled by music, can heal the deepest wounds." Barrett, who watched everything with teary eyes, understood then why he had felt so compelled to help that family. It wasn't just because of Sophia, it was because some stories need to be told, some wounds need to be healed, so that other people can find hope. "I have one more thing for you," Grandma Cecilia announced, taking a last document out of the envelope. "This is the deed to our old house where the original piano used to be. I sold everything I had and bought it back. It's abandoned, it needs renovations, but it can be our new branch," Barrett completed, understanding immediately. "A space in Oak Haven, so that the children there don't need to come all the way here." Grandma Cecilia's smile lit up her wrinkled face. "Exactly, and there's enough room for a family to start over when they're ready." Clara looked at Hank, who kept his eyes down, silent tears running down his face. 90 days of sobriety didn't erase years of mistakes, but they were a beginning that now had more meaning, more purpose. "We can take it slow," she said softly. "One day at a time." Ayla, feeling the emotion in the air, turned to the piano. Her fingers found the keys naturally, beginning to play a new melody, something that was being born at that very moment, a song that spoke of 3 generations united by love and art. Grandma Cecilia sat down at the second piano, her elderly but still agile hands joining her granddaughter's music. Clara took the third piano, and Hank, after a moment of hesitation, began to sing. No longer the lullaby, but something new, a song about forgiveness, rebirth, and hope. The music filled the hall once more, but now it was different. It wasn't just a presentation. It was a declaration, a commitment, a promise that love, when nurtured by art and by forgiveness, can transform even the most broken stories into symphonies of hope. And so, on that morning that began with drizzle and ended with sunshine, a family found its way back through music. Not to what they were before, because some changes are irreversible, but to something new, something stronger, something truer. The cultural center would become known in the city as a place of transformation, where special needs children discovered their talents, where broken families found healing, where music proved, day after day, that some miracles happen in C major. And Ayla? Well, Ayla continued to play, compose, and grow. Her music now carried not only the pain of the past, but the joy of the present and the promise of the future. Because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the most beautiful melodies are born from the most wounded hearts. And so ends our story, not with an ending, but with a new beginning. Because some stories, like some songs, never really end. They just change tone, find new rhythms, and continue to echo through time, touching other hearts, inspiring other new beginnings. Autumn brought a fresh air to the small town, and with it the feeling that everything could finally blossom. 4 months had passed since the inauguration of the Harmony Center, and the hallways that once smelled of fresh paint were now filled with laughter, hurried footsteps, and chords that mixed like colors in a stained glass window. Ayla, Clara, and Hank seemed different, not because they had forgotten the scars, but because they learned to transform them into music. That Friday, however, the day began with a hum of anxiety. At night, the first community spring festival would take place, an event that would bring together children from several neighborhoods and whose tickets, sold at symbolic prices, would be reverted to scholarships. For Ayla, it would be the first time on a real stage. The old municipal theater, closed for years and reopened thanks to Barrett's sponsorship. She would premiere a composition of her own, called Resurging in G Major, written for 2 pianos, children's choir, and her father's voice. Early on, Clara prepared her in the makeshift dressing room, trying to calm her down. Breathe, sweetheart. If your heart races, count to 4, and imagine that each beat is a measure. Ayla smiled. She still wore her new sunglasses, but had dispensed with the cane inside the theater, as she had memorized every step of the way. Hank appeared at the door, wearing the dress shirt he had received from Mrs. Higgins and carrying a thermos of ginger tea. "I brought it so your voice doesn't fail," he said, adjusting the microphone that hung discreetly from his collar. He spoke little, but every word came out firm, like a newly hammered nail. While they adjusted the lights and tuned the instruments, Barrett circulated among volunteers, checking if everything was okay to receive. The families. His cell phone rang twice. He only answered the second time, in a lower tone. "I've already ordered the security to be reinforced. You can rest assured. Today, no one ruins the festival." The fear was not unfounded. Since the corner bar had lost clientele to the Harmony Center's evening classes, Joe from the bar harbored resentment. The short money, the long drinking, and the envy gave rise to a crooked plan. "If that blind girl and the singing father become the town's attraction, who will remember my hooch?" he grumbled. Therefore, in the early morning before the festival, 2 thugs broke into the theater to sabotage the sound system and damage the main piano. They didn't count, however, on Hank being there, testing lights. Upon seeing them circling the stage, he felt the old chill down his spine, the same as when he fled from his own conscience. But this time, he didn't run. He shouted, advanced, tried to protect the piano as if defending a child. There were shoves, a light bulb exploded, and the instrument's top received a blow that left it with deep scratches. The noise alerted the watchman, who called the police. The invaders fled, but left enough clues for Hank to recognize one of them, Joe, a drinking buddy in his worst years. On the day of the festival, a luthier examined the damage. The piano would work, but the cracked top would leave the sound graver, almost with a trapped sob. Ayla frowned, thoughtful, but didn't let it get her down. "Then let it cry with us," she decided, to everyone's surprise. "Music is about being reborn from the cracks. The imperfect sound will remind those who hear us where we came from." Clara swallowed the sob, Barrett nodded with pride. Hank, in silence, felt the guilt throbbing. If he had arrived a minute earlier, if he had been stronger years ago. The ghost of self-pity almost grabbed him, but Ayla touched his arm and asked, "Dad, today we sing louder than any crack. Promise?" He took a deep breath and said yes, in a firm and safe tone. When night came, the theater shone as it hadn't shone in decades. In the packed audience, voices mingled in a murmur of expectation. Children from several neighborhoods occupied their positions in the choir, all uniformed in colorful clothes, forming a large living wheel of tones. Ayla went to the damaged piano. Clara sat at the intact piano, while Hank remained standing, microphone prepared. Ahead, Barrett opened the ceremony with few words, talking about the power of music to heal, to rebuild, and to unite the community. Then the spotlights turned on, and the theater silenced in an almost reverent way. Ayla began the composition with soft chords, answered by Clara's clear arpeggios. Mother and daughter seemed to be conversing through notes, exposing grief and tenderness with each touch. Then the choir came in, intoning simple verses. "We are seeds in the wind, searching for the earth, searching for the sun." The children's voices rose like swallows over hills, and there intertwined with the fluid dialogue of the two pianos. The moment for Hank's solo arrived. He closed his eyes and let the melody lead him through the memories of the times when he had exchanged his family for drinking and anger. He visualized each moment of falling, but also each step that had brought him there. Ayla's hug at the clinic, Clara's silent forgiveness, Mrs. Higgins' courageous support. When he sang, his voice seemed to come from the bottom of a very old well, but it resonated full of redemption. "If the night darkened my steps, and guilt made me a prisoner, today I hear the light in your measures, and I learn to be whole." The syllables merged with the last chords, a crescendo that involved pianos, choir, and voice in a breathtaking harmony. The entire theater held its breath, as if everyone there shared the same accelerated heart. At the end, the silence lasted a second that seemed like eternity. Then the audience exploded in applause, whistles, and open tears. Mrs. Higgins waved a handkerchief, repeating, "Bravo!" Dr. Marcus smiled, filming discreetly. Even some children, without understanding exactly why, felt the emotion and hugged each other. On the upper balconies, figures that used to watch from afar dropped the mask of indifference. No one escaped that moment of catharsis. While Ayla, Clara, and Hank bowed to thank, Barrett went up to the stage holding a cobalt blue envelope. He asked for the floor and announced with a voice choked with enthusiasm, 2 news items. The first, the collection of tickets and anonymous. Donations would allow the Harmony Center to open 2 more classes for special needs children, including the purchase of adapted instruments for those with hearing impairments. The second, the National Symphony Foundation, impressed with the rehearsals and posted videos, had awarded Ayla and Clara a scholarship to participate in the International Inclusive Music Festival in Vienna within 6 months. The audience cheered, applauded once again. Ayla raised her hands to her face, incredulous. Clara hugged her, letting the tears flow. Hank cried without disguise, remembering how one day he had thought that his own life would never be worthy of happiness. But that wasn't the only surprise of the night. Shortly after, when the applause subsided, a white-haired and austere lady emerged from the crowd, bringing a yellowed envelope. Clara paled. "Mom." The old lady, Grandma Cecilia, climbed onto the stage and called the family with a voice fragile, yet determined, "My daughter, how I've waited for this day." She explained that she had always known where Clara and Ayla were, and that she had sent anonymous help through Mrs. Higgins, supporting them discreetly while fearing that Hank's resentment would prevent any approach. Hank, ashamed, wanted to back away, but Grandma Cecilia pulled him by the arm. Some people need to stumble before raising their heads. Music gave you the strength you needed. Grandma Cecilia also brought the deed to an old house sold in the past, now reacquired. It would be donated to the Harmony Center to serve as a branch in the farthest neighborhood, and possibly shelter for the family if they wanted to start over elsewhere. Hearing this, Ayla approached the wounded wooden piano and played some soft notes. Without warning, Clara joined her, and Grandma Cecilia, in an impulse that moved the audience, sat at the second instrument. Hank, still feeling unworthy, stood beside, but his daughter's hands called him closer. "Sing, Dad, sing with us." The melody that arose was new, born right there, mixing memories and the novelty of an open future. The voices of the family seemed to complete each other, each entering at the right moment, with the harmony typical of those who, for a long time, only knew dissonance. The entire community felt that they were witnessing something sacred, the transfiguration of pain into art. The living proof that music and love can, yes, stitch up the biggest wounds. When it was all over, it was impossible to know where the tears ended and the smiles began. People hugged each other without caring about differences, applauded without shyness. The old theater swarmed with life. Ayla, with her face wet, felt, her chest burning, but not with fear, but with enthusiasm for what was to come. Maybe Vienna would be challenging, maybe Hank would have stumbles, and Clara would still carry bitter memories. But now, none of them was alone. They had music, they had each other, and they had an entire community that had learned to break the silence. Outside, the starry sky seemed wider. After the presentation, Ayla sat on the entrance step, hugging a cup of hot chocolate that Hank had brought. He sat down next to her, staring at the stars. "Afraid of the trip?" he asked in a low voice. She shrugged, smiling. "A little. But it's that good fear that pushes us forward, like a dissonant note that makes the harmony worthwhile." Clara joined the hug, and the three remained there, contemplating the sky, hearing in the distance the commotion of those who left the theater with a lighter heart. They didn't know for sure what the future would be like, but they were certain that some stories don't end, they just change tone. And for this family, the tone now was of a new beginning. That's it, folks. And what do you think will happen when Ayla and Clara land in Vienna? Will Hank maintain sobriety while they're away? Has Joe from the bar's resentment completely ended? Comment your theories. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support me and guarantee more exciting chapters of this journey.